Hi, in this module, we're going to go through PSRule for Azure using GitHub. So we're going to walk through how to set up PSRule for Azure within a GitHub repository and use GitHub Actions to go ahead and do test validation of our code. I hope you enjoy it. All right, let's go ahead and create a GitHub repository for PSRule. We're not going to bother with the description, and we're just going to make our repository public. However, you may prefer to make it private for your organization. Great, we're just going to go ahead and grab our Git repo link. Alrighty, over in Visual Studio Code, let's go ahead and clone our repository by typing git clone in the command palette at the top and pasting our repository link. And now it's just asking us to then choose a local path where that repository will be stored. And it's cloned. So let's go ahead and open it up. Now let's go ahead and create a workflow file for GitHub Actions. So if we go ahead and create a new file, and we'll automatically get it to create the directories as we go as well. So let's just go ahead and type in GitHub workflows / repository ML. Great. Now let's go ahead and use the snippet provided by the PSRule Visual Studio Code extension. So to use that, we just need to type in GH, and then you can sort of see that we have a PSRule GH action snippet that we'll select. And right down the bottom here on line 34, we now just need to put in the module that we'd like to use. And so for PSRule for Azure, we type in psrule.rules.azure. Great, we are done for our workflow. So now that we've got our basic workflow, let's go ahead and add some Bicep code in as well. So let's go ahead and add a new folder. And this folder is actually going to be up the tree slightly. So we're going to add it right up here, and we're just going to call it modules. And then we are going to add just a maybe a storage account module. I call it main.bicep. Awesome. So within our file, let's go ahead and create a basic storage account. We're not going to dive super deep at this point. Obviously, we can go even deeper in a later module. However, let's just create a basic storage account, which will allow us to then obviously test to make sure our workflow is actually working. So let's go ahead and start with resource, and we'll just call it storage, and then we will use storage accounts and latest version and required properties, and we're just going to call it something like st test 001. Of course, this probably is not a valid storage account. It may already be taken, but that's okay. It's only used for tests, so we don't need to worry too much about that. Let's go ahead and create a location parameter, and then let's set this to East-US to start off with. Let's go ahead and set it to the resource group deployment location, right, which is generally a best practice. So let's just go ahead and do that, and let's put that in there. And we're just going to use standard LRS, and we'll make this a storage v2, and let's just leave it at that. It's going to call out a few things, but that's okay. That's what it's all about. Right. The last thing that we need to do is to go ahead and add some configuration for PSRule. Now, PSRule will run without any configuration. However, for PSRule for Azure to then handle Bicep code, we do need to tell it to enable expansion so that we can really get any value out of it. For ARM templates, you don't need to enable expansion to get some basic detections. However, to get some more advanced detections, then expansion is required for both scenarios. So let's just go ahead and create a PSRule.yaml file, and we'll set up a few configuration items. So let's start with our configuration. And so this is where we enable expansion. So if we go ahead and control space, then we will have a few different options here. So we want to use bicep expansion, and we want to set this to true, right? So that's what will basically allow PSRule to then look at the bicep code and then basically go through a test for it. So that is definitely something that we want enabled. And then that's probably our initial starting point. There is definitely some configuration we're going to add after we test it out, but let's give it a go before we move too much further. So let's go ahead now and check in our code. And commit. And now let's go ahead and publish our branch because we don't have anything on our repository yet. Great, we're back at our GitHub repository. Let's just go ahead and refresh it, and we should have our code, which we do. We actually can see that our pipeline has already run and failed, which is pretty well expected because we didn't really configure any of the well-architected recommendations. So let's go ahead and have a look. Great. So it's found a number of different issues there. And so this is the, I guess, the detailed view. And we can also go ahead and, click on these links to get additional guidance about the specific rules that have been found. So let's go ahead and do that. And you can sort of see there's some general guidance about how we should actually go ahead and fix this. In this case, it's related to soft delete on storage accounts. So let's just forget about that for now. But let's go ahead and go up to the summary. And it's also important to note that although when we click on those recommendations, it sort of takes us right to the details page, we can also go ahead and sort of see the high level overview, which is typically a little bit easier to read than the detailed view, right? So definitely start here as a first option. There is a few things here that then we might want to configure, right? And so one of the warnings here is about culture. So when the PSRule is running within a GitHub pipeline by default, then it doesn't actually have any culture set. So it's going to use US English by default, but you may prefer to set a different culture. So that can be set in the options. So we'll go ahead and do that when we jump back to Visual Studio Code. There's also a few additional files that, again, it's just flagging that haven't been specifically processed as files, but you can sort of see that we absolutely have gone and analyzed the code from within our Bicep because we can sort of see it's detected the fact that there's a storage account exactly like we named it. And obviously it's come up with each of these rules that have been detections. So let's go ahead and jump back to Visual Studio Code and expand our configuration and also our Bicep code to then implement a test with required parameters. So let's go ahead and do that now. Okay, we're back in Visual Studio Code, and now let's make a few additional changes to our configuration and also to our Bicep code. Let's start with our Bicep code. So you'll notice when I created the storage account module that it had a single parameter, and it's only a optional parameter. So we don't need to specify location. Now, this is probably going to be the case when you do Bicep deployments. You're going to either use parameter files or you're going to do something similar to this in terms of you will specify all the required parameters and there won't be any required parameters left. And so when we're creating modules, though, reusable modules for Bicep, one of the key things that we probably would do would be to have some required parameters. So let's go ahead and update our code, and I'll show you how you can go ahead and have modules that do have required parameters, but still test our code effectively using pretty well the same method that we just did, right? So let's go ahead and add in our name of our storage account. Again, that's probably something that we're going to use. This one doesn't necessarily have to be a required parameter. I'm actually just going to use deployment.name because I find this to be quite effective into communicating when we're actually writing our code. So I'll sort of show you that in a sec. And then we're also going to maybe create a parameter for something like the SKU, right? And we will make this one required, right? And so let's go ahead and just update our code nicely and then provide that there and this one over here. Awesome. All our parameters are linked up. Let's also go ahead and add some additional best practices in terms of well-architected recommendations. So let's go ahead and set our min TLS version. Let's make sure that's TLS 1.2. Let's also go ahead and require encrypted transport. Support HTTPS traffic only. True. We won't correct everything yet, so we will still get some recommendations, but they'll be slightly less on what we previously got. So now we have the situation whereby we have a few different parameters here. I said I was actually going to make this a required parameter, so let's just remove that. Because it's important to sort of know what's going to happen as a result of that. So let's go ahead and just jump. We'll check in our code and then jump back to our pipeline and see what happens from an error perspective. So let's go ahead and check that in. And let's synchronize our changes. Okay, let's go ahead and check our latest commit, which appears to be still running. So let's go ahead and have a look where that's got to. Looks like it's just starting. So let's just wait a few moments for that to complete. And looks like it may not have populated all the information there. But there we go. Refresh has got that there. Yeah, and so you can sort of see here now that we've got this error called fail to expand, right? So effectively what it's sort of saying here is that we've got this parameter SKU and it doesn't know what the value is, right? And so it's fairly important that then it has a value for parameters because it needs to replace and fully resolve or expand those resources. And so when it has no value to put in there, it could guess the value, but that wouldn't really be indicative of what's deploying to Azure. So just like when you deploy to Azure, at some point before you actually do the deployment, you need to specify the values for any parameters that exist within the module or template. And you do that via either specifying a value for required parameters or optional parameters, or for optional parameters, letting it fall back to the default. And so SKU obviously does not have any default parameter, which is the reason why it's failing. So now let's go back to Visual Code and see how we would actually implement a test for a module which does have a required parameter and you actually want to keep it a required parameter. Alrighty, so let's go ahead and make some changes to our module. So if we go ahead and just create a new .tests folder, in here we can then conveniently go ahead and set up a test file, which then will actually test what happens if SKU is populated. So let's go ahead and call it main.tests.bicep. And so we're using a naming convention for a reason. We'll see that when we actually go ahead and configure exclusions for this. But let's go ahead and reference the module. So let's just call it, basic storage. And then we will just go basically up one directory. Again, this sort of keeps it nice and consistent. It's easy to do. And now let's go ahead and give it a name. So again, we're going to call it st test 002 this time, and we'll see some differences there. Now let's go ahead and set our SKU. Of course, that's a required parameter. So let's go ahead and set that to standard LRS. Awesome. The yellow here, this is actually just the bicep linter saying that we should actually specify a location, which is a recommended approach. So let's go ahead and just put a location parameter in here, and we'll just define it in a sec. So location and location string. Fantastic. That's solved our linter issue and also allowed us to find our SKU. Awesome. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to set up an exclusion. So we know that main.bicep has a required parameter in it. And when we go ahead and expand, that's going to be an issue. But we now have effectively an answer file for our module, which will then allow us to test it, right? And we could actually have many tests. There's no reason why we have to have a single one. If we've got a complex module, we may have quite a few different parameters that do different things, maybe conditional parameters that turn on sub-resources or not, or configure them in a very different way. So you absolutely can and should probably test each of those code paths pretty well to however length you want to improve code quality. But for this, we're going to keep it fairly simple. We're just going to add an exclusion and start off with this single test. So let's go to our PSRule .yaml file and we'll configure an exclusion, and we'll also go ahead and set that culture setting that I mentioned before. So let's go ahead and set output, and let's go ahead and just use the culture setting, and I'm just going to set it to EU. And now let's go ahead and set up a ignore. So input, and then this one is actually going to just be the ignore path ignore option. And so effectively what we're going to do here is we're going to exclude files and then include files. So it uses a Git path spec. So when we go ahead and type in something like modules slash asterisk asterisk slash asterisk bicep, it's going to exclude all bicep files. Now I could just use main.bicep, but I'm going to sort of show you an alternative way to do that, which sort of gives you a fair bit of flexibility, right? So that would then also exclude our main.tests file by default, because again, that would match that path spec. So let's go ahead and now include the tests. This would be, let me just put it in quotes for the YAML formatting, and modules slash, and then tests.bicep. And so even though the asterisk.bicep was previously excluded, now tests.bicep is automatically included. It's going to skip our main.bicep, but then process our main.tests.bicep. So let's go ahead and save that. And let's jump back to GitHub. Let's just first save our updates. Great. Commit and sync our changes. And let's see how our pipeline is going. All right, let's go ahead and see our latest action, which is this one here. And you can sort of see, again, there has been some failures. There are less failures than what we previously saw before when we first did our check. Let's jump into our analyzed repositories. So you can sort of see there is no expansion issue here now. We obviously have resolved that. So let's just go ahead and jump in and see our results. And you can sort of see there that then, again, we're still getting the recommendations and a fair bit of detail there, as well as links to how we can actually resolve those specific things. And you can sort of see there, it started to run that particular file, but it actually doesn't really mention that main.bicep file at all because, again, it's been excluded. So pretty well we're ready to use this. Let's go ahead and make a few more additional changes to our GitHub repository because we want to set up some peer reviews. So to do that, we need to enforce a pull request process so that everybody needs to go ahead and branch and then merge their code using pull requests. So if we go up to settings, then we can go ahead and go to our branches and add a rule. So in this case here, we're just going to use main because that is the name of our branch. And so we need to at least tick this option here. We may or may not require some of these additional options. Again, requiring approval is absolutely a great idea. Requiring a review from code owners, even better. I'm just going to start with a super basic option. I'm also then going to set up require status checks. So because we've run our action a few times, it's going to be populated. So we should be able to go ahead and find our action. Hold up just for a sec. There we go. Awesome. So basically, this is what it's saying is that when we go ahead and create a pull request, this action must be successful. Otherwise, and more specifically, the workflow called analyze repository that we created must be successful. Otherwise, it won't allow the code to merge. And so we're also going to enable an additional option down here, which then ensures that even administrators require this by choosing do not bypass the settings above. So even if you're an administrator, you still need to have code that passes. So let's go ahead and hit create. Fantastic. Now let's go ahead and go to Visual Studio Code and then confirm the pull request process is working as we expect. Okay, let's start a new pull request. To do that, let's start with a branch. Great, we've got our branch. Now let's go ahead and make a few changes to our storage account module. So let's address a few of these issues that we had. So let's go ahead and create a blob services subresource. Great, and we will then link that to our storage account parent and then choose default there. Let's go ahead and set our properties and let's sort of set up some soft deletion, right? So default deletion retention policy. Let's go ahead and enable it. And let's also go ahead and set our days to 7. Absolutely, we could go ahead and configure this as a parameter, which is a really great idea. But let's also go ahead and configure our container deletion retention policy. Again, setting this up as a parameter, which would be a great idea. I'm not going to do it though, but definitely do that in your environment. Let's go ahead and do the same thing for file services. Great, and we'll also use the name default there and also configure our retention policy on our file share. And we're also just going to leave it at 7. Fantastic. Let's make a few additional tweaks up here to our configuration. So we do not want all our blob public access so that people cannot create anonymous shares. So that is awesome. And then we might also go ahead and save that and then switch across to our tests and then configure this as GRS. Awesome. Let's go ahead and check in our files now. In fact, let's actually have 2 tests because we sort of want this to fail in our pull request. So let's go ahead and create a new test for LRS. And we'll make this number 3. And let's set up LRS and save that. And check in all those files. And publish our branch. Alrighty, so we do have a branch which we pushed. Let's go ahead and create a pull request. And let's just give it some comments. Create our pull request. And now it's going to go ahead and run our CI checks from the workflow that we defined. And you can sort of see because of our policy that we configured, the required checks need to be run. So that's going to go ahead and run. Let's just wait a few moments for that to occur. And you can sort of see it's failed. So again, we sort of expected that. So let's go to our details, and we can sort of see there's a few things that have failed here. A lot less than when we originally started, but you'll sort of see now that we actually are detecting two storage accounts. So we've got st test02, which is failing with tags, missing tags or no tags. And then we also have the same storage account missing with a storage firewall. So that also needs to be configured. And then we now have storage account st-test 003 failing. And so, again, it also fails with a few additional checks. And the user application is one of those. And let's go ahead and just go up to the summary view. Again, that's slightly easier to sort of see if you've got a few checks. And you can sort of see, again, the additional detections are there. And it's sort of changed a little bit from when we last looked at it. So that's pretty well how we sort of get started with setting up PSRule for Azure within a GitHub repository. I hope you enjoyed the module, and please stay tuned for the next module.